In this video, which will be the last in this series, I will attempt to bring everything together and leave you with something new to think about. From a very young age, I was interested in and quite concerned about existential issues, the miracle and mystery of life. Why are we here? Does life have any meaning and purpose beyond the ordinary worldly aims and ambitions we create for ourselves as we pass through it? In the process, I have come to my own conclusion. If there is a bigger meaning and purpose to life, it can only be to work on ourselves, to strive to be the best we can be. There are two reasons for this. In the first place, any progress we make in this direction will inevitably bring understandings of ourselves and each other, and this will make life proportionately easier. Secondly, if there is a continuation in some form after death, as is the view in Eastern and Western esoteric religious literature, bearing in mind the meaning of the Christian hymn of the Pearl, which we analysed earlier, then the aim of working on ourselves to become fully conscious and integrated is evident. In my own experience, progress is slow and sometimes tedious and painful, but also continuously rewarding, as is the case with any difficult aim we pursue in life. Part of the reason, the biggest reason progress is slow, is that we are easily distracted and forget all about work on ourselves, sometimes for long periods of time. We should realise the world is the way it is because people are the way they are. We cannot change the world because we cannot change people. We can only work towards change in ourselves. This journey begins and is centred in our own psychology, that is, in the exploration and study of ourselves, knowing our fundamental divisions, how they variously connect, and which parts or combinations of parts we inhabit most frequently. We must also undertake the painful exercise in seeing past our heavily idealised self-image and piece together a more representative picture. We must want to see the shadow side, all the hubris, imaginary virtues and qualities, acting, masks, and the very strong defence mechanisms which make this task very difficult, through hiding all these real but rejected and disassociated aspects of self. We cannot work on our preferred but imaginary self, and we do not realise that really we imagine ourselves. As a clever person once said, if our self-image met our actual character in the street, the two would not recognise each other. We do not realise that the virtues we ascribe to ourselves are fictions. We do not realise the extent to which we lie to ourselves and others. We do not realise the extent to which we are slaves to our inner reactions and the happenings of the external world, how insecure, defended, and lacking in will we are. The first work then, as has been repeated over and over in religious esoteric literature from the very beginning, is to know ourselves. As we gain the knowledge, methods and desires to work on ourselves, we soon realise that we do not know ourselves at all. So we must study all of this and see all those things about ourselves which ordinarily we do everything possible not to see. We cannot even begin any work on ourselves until we see our shadow side, because it is exclusively the contents of our shadow side that require work. Among a great many other things, we can come to realise that we exist and live our lives mostly in the lower part of the centres Gurdjieff describes, and which we find in the symbolism we have already explored. The parts which are least conscious and run by themselves, automatically and associatively, without attention or intention. We are, consistent with Eastern and Western religious thought in this sphere, asleep and sleepwalking through life, very much led not by imaginary virtue, but by a shadow. Through repeated observations over a sufficient time, we can easily prove this to ourselves. Connected with this is a very difficult problem I only resolved through the teachings of Gurdjieff. It is the matter of consciousness, self-awareness, self-consciousness, being in the moment, being present, mindfulness, and similar concepts found throughout esoteric religious literature, especially in the East. What was meant by these terms? How to practice it and learn to do it? Among many other things, the two greatest teachings I encountered in Gurdjieffian literature was the foundational 12-part behavioural divisions, already described in brief, and the mechanism behind self-awareness, which is described in this teaching as self-remembering or remembering oneself. I would like to talk about this briefly, as it brought great clarity and gave me a method that I had found nowhere else, and provided me a definite exercise to use in my self-work. The idea is that we become completely immersed or identified in whatever takes our attention, and this happens almost instantaneously. The thing, person, or event in front of us takes our attention, and we disappear in the process. Our attention has one line. So the exercise is to cultivate two lines of attention at the same time. Attention on those things outside of us, and attention on our being, existence, the totality of ourselves, at the same time. The descriptions of remembering oneself had a huge impact on me, and I've worked on this line ever since I came across this knowledge. You see, I had experienced this in its full in my childhood. I was around 13 years of age and playing in my backyard when suddenly I remembered myself. It was a profound experience, accompanied by a heightened emotional state, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was, for a few minutes, fully self-aware. I decided at once that I wanted to keep this experience forever, since it was profoundly different and wonderful, and I was keen to see if I could keep it while I was engaging with other people. So I ran to my friend's house, who lived close by, and began talking with him. As soon as I did so, I ceased to remember myself, and things went back to the way they were. But this event marked me, and later in the day I described what had happened to my father. My father, however, dismissed it as a normal, everyday occurrence. But I knew this was not at all correct. I could not recapture that experience again, and in time I stopped thinking about it altogether. It was not until I encountered Gurdjieff's teaching that I knew what I had experienced, and found a means by which I could work to recapture the experience again, because it was magnificent, and one day, perhaps keep it. So if we decide to try and work on ourselves, we must first of all undertake the work to dismantle our idealized self-image and discover and verify the disowned shadow aspects of self. We must accept those aspects of self completely, regardless of our dislike for them and our utter dismay that we are not as we imagine. Through this, and only through this, we will recognize the urgent need to work on ourselves in the first place. We must recognize how deeply we are asleep and try through any means available to us to inhabit the higher parts of centers, to feel, think and move with attention and intention, and through all this we must try to remember ourselves. That is, to split our attention so that it remains on us as well as the world we engage with at the same time. The term self-awareness is, after all, entirely self-explanatory, but somehow we find it difficult to understand and adequately explain, probably because we have very little experience of it in our everyday lives. The very best of good fortune to those who want to take this road. In the meanwhile, let's return to the subject material we were exploring. The 12 functional divisions explained extensively in this literature, and all that we have discussed in this series of videos, gives us very good reason to take the symbol used by astrology very seriously. In earlier videos, we explored the meaning of the circle and its division into 2 parts, and then 4 parts. It is easy to recognise now that these divisions give us a precise picture of the 4-storey building metaphor used by Gurdjieff's study groups. We understand that the arrangement of the 4 core psychological centres follows the order and numbering of the tetragrammaton, and that Gurdjieff's description and numbering of the 4 fundamental types, man number 1, 1A, 2 and 3, is also a perfect match. Gurdjieff refused to further elaborate on how many types there were. He left that work to us. Because in working ourselves to piece all this together, we would understand so much more and find so many other valuable things that would have been denied to us with a straightforward answer. This was his style of teaching. We are now, however, in a position to do that for ourselves. We know that the tetragrammaton sequence moves in a continuous flow from the division of 4 basic types: intellectually oriented, emotionally oriented, movement and physical body oriented, into 12 further divisions. These divisions correspond perfectly with the 3 parts of the 4 centres, and we notice that the 3 intellectual, emotional, moving and instinctive parts are connected in precisely the same way through 4 triads. The descriptions of the 4 fundamental divisions of the centres and their 3 divisions enable us to draw quite directly from them to describe with some confidence 12 different psychological types. Because the 4 divisions of centres correspond to the 4 fundamental types already described, the 12 subdivisions must correspond with 12 different psychological types. Before we begin, I would like to emphasise that the moving parts of the 4 centres is where learned habits are executed, and there are literally hundreds of habits in each of the centres. They run automatically without attention or intention. The moving parts also initiate daydreams, as well as the dreams we have at night, along with imagination, that kind that runs associatively, automatically, and by itself. We will use this familiar diagrammatic form to determine the 12 different psychological types based on the knowledge we have acquired so far. The intellectual types. These types are characterized by 3 quite distinct styles of thinking and quality of thought. Those types whose psychological centre of gravity resides in the intellectual part of the intellectual centre are immersed in theoretical considerations, collating, analysing and interpreting data. They feel comfortable, satisfied and at home with their intellectual considerations and pursuits, while other sides of their being are left undeveloped, often the emotional side. Those whose psychological centre resides in the emotional part of the intellectual centre are passionate about ideas they encounter or generate, being alternatively highly attracted or repelled by them through emotional engagement. When moved to actuate ideas that bring them joy, they exhibit boundless energy, enthusiasm and perseverance through this emotional charge. Those psychologically centred in the moving part of the intellectual centre are passively, often unconsciously engaged with the automatic incessant stream of associative thoughts that run in the background. They can present as knowledgeable, but their knowledge is rote-learned, most often without any real reasoning or understanding behind it. The emotional types. These types are easily distinguished by three distinct forms of emotional disposition and engagement. The type psychologically centered in the intellectual part of the emotional center are moved to analyze, contextualize, and find explanations, causes, and understanding of their own feelings and emotional reactions to events and those of others. As a result, they are often reluctant to condemn and demonize others for the behaviors and emotional reactions they display. They readily assimilate sound knowledge of emotional cause and effect. Those types centered in the emotional part of the emotional center are characteristically moody types, often withdrawing into themselves to deal with their high emotional gravity, or engaging in destructive pursuits towards the same ends. They tend to hold grudges. It takes them much longer than usual to move from one emotional state to another. When they give full expression to their negative emotions, take a few steps back. It is a powerful experience. The types centered in the moving part of the emotional centers engage in emotionally oriented daydreams, and their incessant stream of feeling-associated thought and fantasy always runs in the background. They learn through emotional imitation and are skilled at learning subtle and dramatic body postures, choreography, and theatrics associated with a wide variety of emotional states. The moving types. These types are distinguished by three different relationships and dispositions regarding dynamic movement. Those types centered in the intellectual part of the moving center aspire to perfection in what they do. They see fine detail and strive to work with care and precision and forethought. They plan and think in fine detail about the processes, steps, materials, and procedures necessary before executing. They always notice and tend to be critical and irritated by sloppy work and/or lack of planning in others. Those types centered in the emotional part of the moving center are emotionally drawn to and led by dynamic movement. They are excited by engaging in or watching dance, sports, athletic displays, ballet, and things like that. They tend to find a feeling of excitement or, on the contrary, feelings of integration or soothing through their emotional engagement with their own dynamic movement. The types psychologically centered in the moving parts of the moving center tend to be impulsive and scattered. They tend to lack planning skills and ignore consequences. They tend to inadequately reflect on past mistakes. They find comfort in busying themselves with all kinds of activity, moving from one task to another associatively without any particular or a pretty loose overall plan or aim. They easily assimilate diverse hands-on skills through imitation and practice and take some pleasure out of that. The instinctive types. The instinctive types engage with the world through their instincts, the body, and the desires and sensations of the body. They are defined through the manner of their engagement with existential threats and issues, income, security issues, survival, material necessities, and preservation of the physical body. Those types centered in the intellectual part of the instinctive triad tend to seek intellectual solutions to life's inherent difficulties. They quickly become absorbed in thought regarding existential issues as they emerge, in order to take the best self-preserving option. They are solution-oriented and constantly seek the path of least resistance, seeking the most efficient way to get what they need through thought and reasoning to alleviate or mitigate potential existential discomfort. Those types whose psychological centre of gravity is in the emotional part of the instinctive triad are defined by their emotional reactions when their existential needs are not met or threatened. They need order and organised environments, and this gives them a sense of control and agency. They tend to carefully plan and arrange in detail future events and engagements for the same reason, to feel as secure as possible and mitigate existential anxiety as they enter the unknown and unpredictable future. They have strong to the point of unhinged negative emotional reactions when plans, their environment or circumstances change unpredictably. Those types whose centre of gravity is in the moving part of the instinctive triad reflexively take action to mitigate life's uncertainties through practical endeavour, often seeking and finding a sense of security through working to build material assets or acquire wealth. They tend to be steady and reliable in their work and are drawn to seek work that allows them to steadily and patiently accumulate over a long period of time. They tend to engage in productive, sensible projects and acquire practical, essential life skills in the process. These descriptions provide us with a rough overview of the 12 psychological types. I do not pretend that they are complete or meticulously precise, but they are in the ballpark. These descriptions differ from all the other attempts to define psychological types that we find in the esoteric, religious, philosophical, and psychological systems we encounter, since they are based on real, verifiable divisions within ourselves, so they have a solid foundation. This, in all probability, explains why exact diagrammatic and textual descriptions of the symbol, thoroughly distorted in modern astrology, has been perpetuated throughout history and cross-culturally in Japan, China, Persia, Gnostic literature, the Old and New Testament, the Vedas, and so on, in its original form. The picture of type gets more interesting again when we remember that each of these parts of centres and their corresponding psychological types are further divided into 3 according to Gurdjieff's framework, according to the historical symbolic references we find everywhere, and in accordance with the Tetragrammaton continuum. So the diagram in front of us reveals a large array of blends of 1, 2, 3, or even 4 overlapping type predispositions of the individual, and provides us with a very nuanced overview of type disposition. I found these descriptions to be very useful and valuable tools in my own work. If nothing else, they remind me to listen and observe people better, ask questions about the way they engage with the world, and I have confidence that these psychological type descriptions are in the ballpark through doing so. This brings us to a final question. Is there a connection between birth dates and type? While the descriptions we have explored do not depend on this, they can be considered, observed, and explored in a standalone manner, the question is still interesting. While I can find no convincing explanation whatsoever as to why type should be determined by a date of birth, I cannot rule it out altogether either. We must remember that our current knowledge is particularly small in comparison to a comprehensive knowledge of the all and everything. There is so much that we don't know. Perhaps through the Tetragrammaton continuum, the whole and the parts of God, the individual, and the world arrange themselves along the same lines, forming the same patterns. We can only imagine and speculate. I have, nonetheless, spent a great deal of time exploring this question, arranging the circle of type around the yearly calendar, comparing these descriptions with people known and unknown to me, with much better than expected results. I found this delightful but also quite annoying, since it is impossible to explain the mechanism of this. In the process, it seemed possible to me that this system, following the diagram we have explored, could be used to determine types which were most compatible with each other. Again, the results far exceeded expectation. According to my work on this, there are 2 completely compatible types for each of us, defined by a particular birth date. And to my astonishment, I began dating a woman who was born on one of them. We are now very happily married. As I mentioned, the type system outlined here is standalone. It does not depend on birth dates, and I will not elaborate further on its use in relation to the date of birth, as I do not know the mechanisms, if any, behind it. So this is where we will leave things. I hope you got something out of this series of videos, and please feel free to copy, share, borrow from, or develop these ideas as you like. And so, for the last time, thanks for listening.